5 times in history, a tiny force stared down a massive empire and won. Not by luck, not by accident, but by outsmarting, outmaneuvering, and outthinking an enemy that had every advantage on paper. Most people believe that size wins wars, that numbers equal victory. But the truth is, some of the most decisive moments in military history were decided by commanders who understood something the giant never did. Stay with me, because what these small armies pulled off will completely change how you think about power. Let's start with one of the most jaw-dropping upsets in ancient history. And it begins not with a famous general or a legendary empire, but with a tiny Greek city-state that nobody expected to survive the week. The year is 480 BC. The Persian Empire under Xerxes I is arguably the most powerful force on Earth. His army, by ancient accounts, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Modern historians estimate somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers, still an almost incomprehensible force for the ancient world. His navy stretched across the horizon. His logistics chain stretched from Persia all the way across the Hellespont. He had every resource, every advantage, and every reason to believe this campaign would be over fast. What he didn't account for was a narrow coastal pass called Thermopylae. King Leonidas of Sparta arrived there with approximately 7,000 Greek soldiers, including his now famous 300 Spartans. The terrain did something extraordinary. It neutralized Xerxes' numbers almost entirely. The pass was so narrow that the Persians could only attack in a limited front, stripping away their greatest advantage. The Greeks, trained for exactly this kind of disciplined close-quarters combat, held that pass for 3 days. 3 days against the greatest army the ancient world had assembled. Here's what most people miss about Thermopylae. Yes, the Greeks ultimately fell when a traitor revealed a hidden mountain path that allowed the Persians to flank them. Yes, Leonidas and his 300 died there. But the strategic outcome? The delay gave the Greek city-states time to organize their naval forces. And just weeks later, the Athenian fleet devastated the Persian navy at the Battle of Salamis, effectively ending Xerxes' campaign. The small army didn't just fight bravely, it made the eventual Greek victory possible. Thermopylae teaches us that terrain is a force multiplier. Choose the right ground, and a small army defeats a large army, not through brute strength, but through geometry. But that's not the crazy part. Because roughly 1,800 years later, a commander on the other side of the world was about to pull off something even more audacious. It's 1426. The Tran dynasty of Vietnam has been living under Ming Chinese occupation for over 2 decades. The Ming Empire is enormous, one of the most powerful states on the planet at that point in history. And the Vietnamese rebel commander Lê Lợi has spent years waging a guerrilla campaign that the Ming military establishment viewed as little more than an irritant, just a regional nuisance, an insect buzzing around a giant. That condescension would cost them everything. Lê Lợi had studied the terrain of Vietnam's dense forests and winding rivers with obsessive precision. He understood something critical: the Ming army's greatest strengths, their massed infantry. Their supply chains, their coordinated field formations were completely useless in that environment. So he refused to fight on their terms. He refused open battle. Instead, he used rapid movement ambushes and deception to keep the Ming forces constantly off balance. At the Battle of Tot Jong Chuch Jong in 1426, Lê Lợi lured a Ming force of over 100,000 soldiers into a swampy enclosed valley. His forces, a fraction of that number, struck from multiple concealed positions simultaneously. The result was devastating. Tens of thousands of Ming soldiers were killed, captured, or routed. The psychological shock was so severe that the Ming command structure never fully recovered its confidence in the theater. Within 2 years, after another catastrophic Ming defeat at Chi Lung Shuang, Jiang, the Ming Empire negotiated a withdrawal from Vietnam entirely. A small army defeats a large army, not just on the battlefield, but in the negotiating room. What Lê Lợi understood, and what the Ming commanders never fully grasped, was this: the battlefield you choose is as powerful as the weapons you carry. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the next example flips the script entirely. Instead of fighting in jungles and mountain passes, this one happened in open desert. And the underdog won anyway. It's 217 BC. A Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca has already done the impossible. He crossed the Alps with war elephants and invaded Italy from the north. The Roman Republic is scrambling. They've already suffered 2 significant defeats and are desperate to stop him. At Lake Trasimene, a Roman army of roughly 30,000 soldiers under consul Gaius Flaminius pursued Hannibal's force along a narrow road flanking the lake. Flaminius was confident. He had numbers. He had the weight of Roman military tradition behind him, and he was following a retreating enemy, which meant psychologically he felt like he was winning. He wasn't. Hannibal had positioned the bulk of his forces hidden in the forested hills on the north side of the road in a perfect arc. When the Romans entered the corridor between the hills and the lake, Hannibal triggered his trap. His soldiers attacked from 3 sides simultaneously in the fog of an early morning mist that reduced visibility to almost nothing. The Romans never had time to form their battle lines. Within 3 hours, approximately 15,000 Roman soldiers were dead, including Flaminius himself. It remains one of the most complete ambushes in military history. Here's the detail that gets lost in the headline story. Hannibal didn't just set a trap. He spent days studying Roman military psychology, their aggression, their confidence, their disdain for retreat. He manufactured a situation that played directly into Flaminius's assumptions. The trap wasn't set on the terrain. The trap was set in Flaminius's own mind. Hannibal simply provided the path. That's a lesson that echoes across every conflict on this list. The best commanders don't just outfight their enemies, they outthink them. But wait, it gets even more surprising. Because sometimes the giant doesn't just lose a battle, it loses everything. And that brings us to one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in medieval military history. September 1223. The Mongol Empire is at the height of its expansion, the largest contiguous land empire in human history, with a cavalry-based military that had crushed everything in its path from China to Eastern Europe. A Mongol reconnaissance force under generals Jebe and Subutai had been probing the Caucasus and southern Russian steppe, defeating every army that confronted them. The combined forces of the Cumans and the Kievan Rus princes assembled a coalition army. Estimates vary, but likely somewhere between 20,000 and 80,000 men, to stop a Mongol force that was smaller, isolated deep in foreign territory and seemingly vulnerable. The coalition leaders were confident. Numerical superiority, home territory advantage, a chance to destroy an overextended enemy far from its support base. What the coalition didn't understand was how the Mongols used retreat as a weapon. At the Battle of the Sit River, and more critically in the lead-up at the Kalka River, Subutai executed a deliberate false retreat, drawing the coalition cavalry forward in pursuit, stringing them out across miles of open steppe. Then his forces turned, struck the pursuing cavalry in the flank and rear, and systematically shattered the formation. The coalition army collapsed. The Kievan Rus princes were captured and executed. The Cumans fled. The Mongols had won with a smaller, isolated force in hostile territory because they understood one thing the coalition didn't. Confidence is a vulnerability. An enemy certain of its own superiority makes assumptions, and assumptions create gaps. Subutai simply walked through the gap. Now here's what most people completely miss when they study these 5 stories together. There's a pattern, a clear, repeatable pattern that runs through every single one of these upsets. None of these commanders tried to win on the enemy's terms. Not one of them said, let's meet their strength with our strength, their numbers with our numbers, their resources with our resources. Every single victory on this list was built on the same foundation, an almost ruthless understanding of what the larger enemy believed, assumed, and expected. And then a deliberate, calculated decision to violate every single one of those expectations simultaneously. The final example on this list is perhaps the least talked about and the most strategically sophisticated. It's 1879. The British Empire is at its peak. The Anglo-Zulu War has just begun in southern Africa. The British force at Isandlwana, approximately 1,700 men, is encamped in what their commanders consider a perfectly secure position. They have rifles, they have artillery, they have all the technological advantages of a Victorian-era imperial military. Facing them is a Zulu army of approximately 20,000 warriors, armed primarily with traditional weapons. The British commanders made a catastrophic assumption that firepower automatically negated numbers. They didn't form a defensive perimeter. They didn't create a protected camp. They were confident in their technology, and that confidence made them careless. The Zulu commanders used their classic encircling formation, known as the Bull's Horns, or Isimpondo Zankomo, to envelope the British position from multiple directions simultaneously. The British lines were stretched too thin to maintain concentrated fire on any one axis. Ammunition distribution broke down under pressure, and within hours over 1,300 British soldiers were dead in one of the worst military defeats in British imperial history. The Zulu victory at Isandlwana wasn't a lucky charge. It was a tactically executed operation that exploited British overconfidence with precision. The smaller army defeats a large army because large doesn't automatically mean smart. What connects Thermopylae to Isandlwana across thousands of years, across entirely different cultures, weapons and terrain is this. The commanders of small forces consistently did something the giant refused to do. They took the enemy's perspective. They thought about what the larger force believed. They worked backward from those beliefs to design a reality that turned every strength into a trap. The giant always has more. More soldiers, more resources, more institutional confidence. But the giant is also almost always fighting the last war. It's fighting based on what worked before, and the small army that wins every time is the one that figured out how to make the past a liability for its enemy. So here's what these 5 battles actually have in common, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Terrain, psychology, deception, refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. Every single small army that humiliated a giant empire on this list did it not because they were luckier, but because they were more strategically honest about reality. They looked at the actual situation, not the situation they wished they had. What I want to know from you is this: which of these 5 commanders do you think showed the highest level of strategic thinking, and why? Drop your answer in the comments. I read everyone. If this kind of deep dive military history is what you're here for, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell. It's the single best way to make sure you never miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.